Hello students, it's Miss Gilcher, and I would like to help you understand and build some background information about our new unit, which is based on the concept of influence. First, let's take a look at our goals and what I would like you to achieve during this slideshow. Students will understand how beliefs and experiences from childhood impact adult decisions and reactions by building background knowledge about a variety of topics, analyzing various texts, and synthesizing information into an argumentative essay. What is influence? Influence is the power to sway thoughts, beliefs, or actions. It's also the ability to affect a person or event either positively or negatively. It can be intentional or inadvertent, and it also comes from a variety of sources, including but not limited to politicians, music, TV, family, culture, community, social media, peers. Let's take a look at a few common expressions that we use every day. Take a moment to consider these and write down what they mean. Under the influence, bad influence, above the influence. Pause right now and write your answers. Consider these examples of influence: presidential debates, news programs, talk shows, video games. Music, for example, some would think that gangster rap has an influence on urban violence. Some have asserted that Marilyn Manson had an influence on the massacre at Columbine High School. Reality television, peer pressure, cults, gangs, terrorism, propaganda, the Japanese internment camps, Rosie the Riveter, the Nazi government. Here's what we know. Influence can be positive. It can be friendly competition, encouraging each other, welcoming others, teaching others. But it can also be bad. It can be peer pressure, the loss of individuality, the loss of the ability to think for yourself, bullying, oppression, crime, stereotyping, racism, gender bias, human rights violations, name-calling, racial slurs, homophobia, and anti-Semitism. So consider this. If we are disgusted when we read, learn, and hear about the Holocaust, why do we continue to allow these things to happen today, despite what we know from our history? Pause now and write your answer. So what is the basis for the atrocities we will read about in the book Night, which is about the Holocaust? The idea of anti-Semitism is the basis for these atrocities. The prefix anti means against, and the word Semitism comes from the word Semitic, which means descending from the ancient southwestern Asian cultures, including the Akkadians, Phoenicians, Hebrews, and Arabs. Anti-Semitism is centuries old, and it originated when the Roman Empire conquered Egypt and the development of Christianity began. Scholars are still debating why the Jews were singled out for destruction. It's important to note, though, that this did not start with Hitler or even in the 20th century. This went back to the very beginning of what we now know as the Roman Empire. Historians have traced negative feelings about the Jews back to over 2,000 years to the time of the Roman Empire and the beginnings of Christianity. Jesus lived as a Jew in Palestine at the time of crisis. After the Romans conquered the country, they insisted that the Jews not only obey Roman laws, but also worship Roman gods, just as all of the other conquered people did. When Jews refused to do so, they were labeled stubborn, clannish, and hostile. As pressure to accept Roman culture mounted, Jews searched desperately for a way to maintain their religious identity. Some urged open rebellion against Rome. Others, including Jesus, argued for peace. As each side marshaled arguments in defense of its position, the debate increased in intensity. Still, all of the attacks and counterattacks took place within the context of Judaism. Only when Jesus' disciples separated themselves from Judaism did their words take on new meaning. They became, in the words of Christer Stendhal, a professor of Christian studies, missiles hurled from mainly Gentile church toward the synagogue across the street, from which now those Jews who followed Jesus had been excommunicated. And by that shift, Christian anti-Judaism was born. He goes on to say that much has been written about why and how the parting of ways happened, but no one factor was decisive. But once the division was established, both the church and the synagogue felt the necessity to define themselves by sharpening their differences, even though the two faiths are more likely alike than they are different. As a result, each came to regard the other as not only different, but also suspicious and even dangerous. As a small minority in Europe, Jews were particularly vulnerable to attacks by the Christian majority. By the 16th century, many were totally isolated from their Christian neighbors. Stop right now and think about 16th century. What else was going on throughout the world around that time? In a number of countries, people of the Jewish faith were confined to ghettos, sections of a city or town enclosed by high walls and guarded by Christian gatekeepers. With more rigid separation came new myths and misinformation. Jews and other minorities were increasingly portrayed as agents of the devil, responsible for every catastrophe from random crime to plague and drought. People had moved from fearing those they did not know to regarding them as the enemy. By the 1700s and 1800s, even as the walls of the ghettos were coming down, a new idea was reviving, the old myths and misinformation. This idea was race. Until the 1800s, the word referred mainly to people who shared a nationality or were related to one another in some way. Now, many scientists use the term race to refer to those who had a genetic heritage in common. Some were so certain that race explained all of the cultural differences they observed in the world that they distorted facts or made claims they could not substantiate. Many even ranked the races, at the top being the Aryans, a mythical people that left India in the distant past and carried its language and culture westward. A number of people took pride in tracing their ancestry to the Aryans. Increasingly, these Europeans and Americans believed that, as the descendants of the Aryans, they were superior to other races, including the Jewish or Semitic race. In the past, Jews were targeted for discrimination because of their religious beliefs. Now they were excluded because of their race. Anti-Semitism, which literally means against Semites, was coined specifically to describe this new hatred of Jews. Scientists who showed the flaws in racist thinking were ignored. In the late 1800s, the German Anthropological Society tried to determine whether there were really racial differences between Jewish and Aryan children. After studying nearly 7 million students, the society concluded that the two groups were more alike than different. Historian George Moss notes that the survey had surprisingly little impact. The idea of race had been infused with myths, stereotypes, and subjectivities long ago, and a scientific survey could change little. The idea of pure, superior races and the concept of racial enemy solved too many pressing problems to be easily discarded. By the early 1900s, race had become the distorted lens through which too many people viewed the world, and as racist thinking became respectable, attacks against Jews and other minorities intensified. These attacks were particularly virulent in times of stress and uncertainty, like the worldwide depression that began in the late 1920s and early 1930s. At such times, having a racial enemy who can be blamed for society's problems offers an easy answer to complex problems. In 1933, for example, a Protestant minister in Germany wrote, "In the last 15 years in Germany, the influence of Judaism has strengthened extraordinarily. The number of Jewish judges, Jewish politicians, Jewish civil servants in influential positions has grown noticeably. The voice of the people is turning against this." Yet government statistics paint a very different picture. In 1933, Jews made up less than 1% of the population. And of the 250 Germans who held prominent government posts between 1919 and 1933, only 4 were Jews. The myth of a Germany dominated by Jews was fostered by groups like Adolf Hitler's National Socialist or Nazi Party. In speech after speech, they maintained that Jews were everywhere, controlled everything, and acted so secretly that few could detect their influence. The charge was absurd, but after hearing it again and again, many came to believe it. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor or Prime Minister of Germany. Within weeks, he had set into motion a series of laws and orders that replaced a democratic government with a dictatorship based on race and terror. From the start, he targeted Jews as the enemy. Little by little, step by step, they were separated from their neighbors. Then, in 1935, Hitler announced 3 new laws that stripped Jews of citizenship and made it a crime for Christians to have contacts with them. Once he was firmly in control of Germany, Hitler turned his attention to neighboring countries. By 1940, he ruled much of Eastern and Western Europe. In one conquered nation after another, Jews were identified, isolated, and ultimately singled out for murder. By 1943, most European Jews were either dead or on their way to death camps. Only one large group was still alive, the Jews of Hungary. They were safe chiefly because Hungary was an ally of Germany rather than a conquered nation. As an ally, Hungary had its own anti-Jewish laws, but Miklos Horthy the nation's other leaders were not willing to murder or expel Hungarian Jews. By 1943, Hitler was demanding that they did so. He wanted jurisdiction over Hungarian Jews. When the Hungarians refused to grant it, he took control of the government. By the spring of 1944, the Nazis were shipping 12,000 Hungarian Jews a day to their death. Night is the true story of a teenager who was among the hundreds of thousands of Jews deported that spring. Fewer than 1 out of every 4 of them survived the Holocaust. So I leave you with these questions to ponder. And I'd like you to really continue to think about them throughout your experience with this book. What is the relationship between our stories and our identity? And to what extent are we all witnesses of history and messengers to humanity?